We're going to go through the process of data triangulation and the competing pathway analysis. This is the point where we begin to move from assessment to intervention planning and development. The purpose of triangulation is to compare at least three sources of information and look for consistency. The extent to which the different sources of data tell you the same thing are going to give you more confidence in your results. So in this example, the three sources of information for Tyler are a scatter plot, a teacher interview, and the functional assessment direct observation form. The three sources could just as easily be a teacher interview, student interview, and the FADO. I like for at least one of the sources of information to be actual data collection or direct observation, either the ABC form or the FADO or something similar. For the other source, usually it's some kind of interview. And then the third source is sometimes a file review or sometimes just other sources of information. Sometimes you may interview two adults, a teacher and a teaching assistant, and then do a direct observation. That would be three sources of data as well. For the purposes of your assignment, I'm only requiring you to do one interview and one observation, but the third source of data could be just talking informally to someone else or looking through the student's file. Usually there's another source of information that you're bringing in. So if you look at the scatter plot, it showed that Tyler was having some difficulty during math, language, social studies, and science, and problems happened less during PE. So that doesn't tell us much about specific antecedents, but it does indicate what times of the day are going to be more problematic. That'll give us some guidance as to when it would be best to collect some observational data. The teacher interview suggested that Tyler was engaging in this behavior to get attention from adults and from peers. And then she further indicated that it did sometimes involve him delaying a task. When we actually collected some functional assessment observation, this pretty much confirmed what the teacher had said. Sometimes that isn't the case, but in this case it was. When Tyler would engage in these behaviors, he would blurt out answers and say inappropriate things and laugh. There were some other things he would do. Other kids would laugh at this time. Sometimes they would make comments as well. And the teacher would come over and redirect him. Other kids did not consistently respond to him because the teacher was there and she'd sort of look at him. But about half the time it did. And we know from class that problem behaviors can be intermittently reinforced just like appropriate behaviors. So that's certainly enough to possibly maintain the behavior. So when we interpret all of this, the precipitating events or the antecedents, it's clear that when he gets something that may be too difficult, that's when we're most likely to see a problem. The maintaining consequences based on our three sources of data, well, certainly with two of those three, it's desired attention from adults and peers, and possibly also a delay in the task. So what's the likely function? During classes with high academic demands, the student will disrupt the class in order to escape the task or access peer or adult attention. And one thing that we are not really sure of, from the observational data, the teacher would redirect him and give him assistance at the same time she was giving him some attention. So it's not possible to tell from our data whether or not he is trying to elicit some help from the teacher or whether it's more attention. We know that peer attention is probably a factor. This would require some kind of functional assessment manipulation to test out. Usually in a situation like this, we might go ahead and develop an intervention rather than doing some kind of manipulation. That isn't always necessary. And in this case, I probably would not do that because if he was trying to get help and assistance from the teacher, part of the intervention would be to teach him to appropriately ask for help. That's not a bad thing to do under any circumstance. So it would be best just to add that to the intervention. So again, triangulation is putting your sources of information side by side, determining if they all point in the same direction. In this case, they do. That gives you a lot more confidence that your identified function is going to be correct. Once we have a hypothesis, we move on to planning our intervention. The tool for that is the competing behavior pathway. The first thing we do is we look at our existing hypothesis, and that would be the top, and we indicate the antecedents, the behavior, and what we believe the maintaining consequences to be. Then we look at a replacement behavior, something that might lead to the same function as a problem behavior, and we consider what antecedents might be relevant here. And then finally, we look at a desired pathway. We look at the behavior that we ultimately want the student to do, and we realize that this may be something that'll take some time to get to. We may have several intermediate steps before we get to that final desired behavior. But we need to think in terms of what are the antecedents that would occasion that behavior, and what kinds of maintaining consequences might we need to maintain that behavior. So we start with the existing problem. The problem is that he makes inappropriate comments, he blurts out answers or blurts out things, he'll whisper to peers, he'll giggle and laugh, he refuses to complete his work. This usually happens when the teacher hands out math worksheets. She hands out 20 problem sheets, and the expectation is that the students complete the task. The setting in which this occurs is whole group instruction or whole class instruction. She puts problems on the board and she goes over them orally. And we believe in our hypothesis that the maintaining consequence is peer and adult attention along with escaping the task. So, let's consider what kind of replacement behavior would lead to appropriate adultation. One possibility would be to have him work cooperatively with the team. So since our function, or hypothesized function of the behavior is that it is maintained by peer attention and escape and teacher attention, an alternative behavior would be to have him working cooperatively in groups, participating in the group, and therefore accessing some peer attention, and then having him raise his hand or ask for assistance in some way when he gets to something difficult. This would lead to some adult attention and some peer attention. And also, if escape is part of the function, it would lead to him getting some help with something that's difficult. The antecedents would be a little bit different here because we've changed the situation. So we have some group and individualized assignments rather than the worksheets. So we've changed the antecedent as well as provided some alternative way of responding. Now sometimes we have to provide some instruction to students. We have to teach them alternative behaviors. We'll be talking about that in the next couple of PowerPoints. And sometimes we have to do a more detailed analysis of an alternative behavior. This one is a fairly simple one, so it's a good one to start with. We've also changed the situation a little here. Rather than having whole class instruction, we've divided up into small group instruction. Obviously, if you didn't have other kids that could benefit from small group instruction as well, this might not be an intervention that you would do. But usually something that's helpful to one student in a situation like this is going to be something that would be helpful to other students. And this is just one example, of course. So in addition to the replacement behavior, we all do a competing pathway of a desired behavior. The desired behavior is what we would ultimately like the student to be able to do. And in this case, it's complete tasks, work cooperatively, raise his hand and ask for help when he needs it. And the maintaining consequences, a little bit different from the replacement behavior and problem behavior, but probably more delayed. We'd like for him to be able to work for more extended periods of time and then get praise and feedback for it. We also would like for them to be able to take turns, and some of the antecedents would be having students take turns as being peer leaders, working with groups. So this might involve teaching kids to work more cooperatively with groups as well. So this is just an example of how we would look at the big picture by taking the existing hypothesis for the problem behavior and sketching it out like this. It enables us to see what we're working with. This is the reinforcer that's currently happening. If we want a replacement behavior to be maintained, we have to compete with the reinforcement the problem behavior is already getting. Also, we have to consider, if we want the desired behavior to occur, sometimes we have to provide more reinforcement there. Sometimes we might have to provide some kind of structured reinforcement system. And we're going to spend time in the course talking about how to develop those as well. But this is a big chunk of what you'll be doing for your assignment. You'll be taking your data from your interview, from your functional assessment observation, and then from a more informal source like a record review or a discussion with the student. You'll be putting that onto the triangulation form, summarizing the results of each of those sources of information, and then developing some hypotheses about why the behavior is occurring. Then you'll complete the competing pathway analysis we have here, starting out with just restating your hypothesis, then looking at possible replacement behaviors and what the desired behaviors are in that situation. This is the first step in moving from assessment to intervention planning. When I look at examples of functional behavior assessment that are conducted in school settings, what I often see is a disconnect between the data people have collected and the intervention plans they put into place. The process we're describing here is the beginning of using that assessment information to actually do something with it. That's something that's usually lacking, and it's something that often is not well understood by staff in school settings. So my hope is that you'll see this as a useful exercise. Once you've done it a couple of times, you can do it fairly quickly. I can sit down with a group of people and I can usually go through this in about 15 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time. Again, the first couple of times you do it, it might take a little longer, but it can be done fairly quickly, and it's well worth the time because it gives you some direction in your intervention plans. I mean, just looking at this simple example here, we can see that we may need to do some instruction on teaching some replacement behaviors. We may need to do some environmental arrangement. We may need to change the way we're doing instruction, and we may need to do something to motivate the student to complete more work. So we'll be doing some more exercises of this together in class. As you start working on your individual projects, if you run into any difficulties, be sure to send me an email. Talk to me about it. I'm usually able to help people out by just asking you a few questions.